So, Rod, this is a super interesting time. I would say we're at the part of the Bitcoin crypto cycle where both Bitcoin and crypto typically go parabolic. But what's known as October has actually taken a massive left turn because of these tariff negotiations with China. There's a lot of people who were on leverage, who were traders that were wiped out. Many Bitcoin and crypto investors began to doubt that they would see the typical parabolic phase of the cycle. And in mid October, during that doubt, you tweeted, "Position yourself. Parabolas are coming." What made you confident in that? And what perhaps did you see that others didn't?
Yep. So first things first, markets have a way of shaking people out before the real big exponential moves happen. Because the way it works is markets naturally, game theoretically, want to leave as many people as possible sidelined. That's one thing fundamentally to understand. Second thing is, like you alluded to, we're kind of entering an era of great power conflict, massive, bilateral tariffs between countries. Obviously, in the short term, that can scare the markets. Third of all, um, typically when the American central bank is still engaging in quantitative tightening, crypto suffers, especially the altcoin complex, and we've seen that in 2018. However, the Fed has been kind of technically doing QT over the past 2 years, but nevertheless, the crypto total market has managed to 8x in total since the end of 2022, which is quite remarkable. And recently, Powell has signaled that he's going to pause QT, which I think is like an early signal that the promised quote unquote altcoin season might finally happen. Last but not least, I think we are in a period where people that still believe in the 4-year cycle, they are selling. And I think we need to digest them before we can move higher. I personally think that, there shall come a point where 4-year cycles don't hold anymore. I think fundamentally it was never about the Bitcoin halvings, but rather about central banking activity cycles, business cycles, etc. And in my point of view, this time around, it's going to be more of a 4.5, 5-year cycle rather than a 4-year cycle. That's my view. And so I think the patient ultimately will be rewarded. And I still remain bullish for the next 3, 4, 5 months.
Okay, very interesting. And so there's some of these structural differences, and maybe perhaps you can help us understand as well how then you expect things to play out over these coming months ahead. So another X post that you made in mid-October was, "There are months where nothing happens, then there are days where years happen. These days are coming." So can you elaborate on what specifically you're referring to there?
Typically, the most crazy returns, crazy headlines, crazy stories that you see in crypto happen towards the end of the cycle. And the reason they happen structurally on the ground is because somebody hears about their cousin kind of succeeding in crypto, or their classmate or their coworker, and then that person also gets in. And then like the third person hears the second person succeeding, they get in as well. And that's why you have these special periods once every few years in crypto where a disproportionately large number of retail either join crypto for the first time or return after being kind of tourists, so to speak, right? And I think so far, if you look at typical retail indicators such as Coinbase, app downloads, and some other similar signals, really, other than very, very briefly at the end of 2024, in the grand scheme of things, I still think retail hasn't been a big part of this cycle. I think BTC's rise from 100 or 15K to 125K has been predominantly driven by institutions, ETFs, and DATs. And I think that typical sort of retail spike that we see is yet to come. And that's why ultimately holders and believers, I think, are going to be rewarded. Now, the big difference that I expect this time compared to past cycles is in 2025 and in 2017, you could essentially pretty much buy anything during like mania periods, and it would go up. Ultimately, I think this time around is going to be different, and I'll tell you why. For example, in 2021, out of the top 100 cryptocurrencies, especially during the bullish months, you would have 60 or 70 of them outperform BTC. However, in 2024, which wasn't even a mania period, you would have only 24 coins outperform BTC. And this year so far, you only have about 15 coins outperform BTC, which in my opinion is a sign that investors are getting more discerning. The market is getting more selective. The market is getting more competitive. Investors want to pile into strength. Winners continue to outperform. And generally, I think it's a sign that crypto markets are maturing. Instead of everything going up and down at the same time, you really have kind of narrower pockets of the markets winning. And typically, these are either category leaders or really things that are truly different. And even if you look at like the 14 coins in the top 100 that are outperforming BTC this year, half of them are either number one or number two in their respective category, which means that at least right now or up until now this cycle, investors are somewhat playing it safe when it comes to altcoins. And instead of buying a kind of category member number 6, category member number 7, what they're doing is they're buying category leaders as their expression on the bullishness of a certain category, right? So which coins are doing well or outperforming BTC so far in the past 12 months, in the past 24 months? You have Hype, which is the number one DEX. You have BNB, which is the number one SEX. You have Zcash, which is the number one privacy coin. You have SPX 6900, which in my opinion is number one movement coin / meme coin, depending on how you look at it. And so in my opinion, even if we do see a mania, it's still going to be selective and very important, in my opinion, to be buying things that have already been doing well up until now, right? If the coin hasn't been beating BTC for the past 2 years, then it's kind of a gamble to buy it. That's the way I see it. Like, essentially, if we consider the past 2 years hard conditions as far as altcoins go, then if a coin has been doing well, or if an altcoin has been doing well in these hard conditions, I think it's going to do very well during kind of mania periods. Because there is some special sauce about that particular community or that particular asset that if it did quite well during hard times, it's going to go ballistic during good times. And I think ultimately a combination of quantitative tightening and the emergence of pump fund made it so that there are fewer altcoins that are doing well compared to last time. The way I see it is essentially the weaker have become weaker and the stronger have become stronger. But the bright side here is that instead of having to choose from 100 coins, kind of discerning investors now only have to choose between like 10, 12 coins. And I think ultimately it's a good thing. And disproportional amount of volume, interest, and investors are going to pile into these kind of 12 coins. And ultimately, I think you just join one of these 12 teams and ride the wave. That's kind of what I've been saying.
You mentioned you think there's going to be an extended cycle. I have been hearing that from some other folks as well who focus on the macro. You have Bitcoin ultimately going to 200K this cycle. Typically, the cycle would end in Q4. There are some people who think that it could potentially get there by the end of this year, but that would basically mean Bitcoin would have to double the next 2 months. It's not crazy given that the majority of Bitcoin's gains typically comes in just, I think, roughly 10 days of the year. So it's not like impossible, but you're talking more about this extended cycle rather than, I think, this blow off top by the end of Q4. So can you tell us why and what structural differences you see? And maybe it ties directly to what you were saying about the Fed ending QT. And, we have rate cuts coming. So maybe it's tied to this these different macro structural factors. But can you share a bit more about the 5-year extension that you've seen?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people in Bitcoins and crypto in general history so far, they thought that the reason that BTC and crypto at large typically followed these very predictable 4-year patterns was because the BTC halving is also on this 4-year tempo, right? However, I think it was purely a coincidence. And it was never about the halvings. And I think as years go by and as cycles go by, it's the importance of halvings is increasingly less important. Why? Because when you go from, for example, 20% inflation to 10% inflation, that's kind of a big deal. But when you go from 2% inflation to 1% inflation, it's no longer that big of a deal. And I think right now there are bigger forces at play. Ultimately, I think the thing that has been driving BTC markets, at least the last 2 or 3 cycles, was actually year over year money supply growth, right? If you chart the graphic of a year over year money supply growth over BTC price, they match almost perfectly. And I think that correlation and that causation, frankly, is much more powerful than halvings or anything else. Now, I think even though the money supply has been steadily going up over the past several months, and have actually recently made a new high, both in America and the world overall, it's still continuing to go up. And I think as long as it's continuing to go up in general, you have to remain bullish BTC. Whenever that slows down for whatever reason, that's when you would be cautious. But to put it bluntly, as long as the M2, M3, however you measure it, the money supply is going up, you have to continue remaining at least a cautious, if not an optimistic bull on Bitcoin. So that's kind of like roughly how I think about the situation.